Joining us now is Emily Kopp. She's a reporter at US Right to Know. She's done some of the best work that there is on the lab leak hypothesis on that investigation. She's joining us now for our latest report. Thank you so much for joining us, Emily.
Great to be here.
Absolutely. So we've covered your work here for a long time, and we have one of your latest that we can put up there on the screen. Let's see it. US scientists propose to make viruses with unique features of SARS-CoV-2 in Wuhan. All right, so it's a headline of which is, we got a little bit of some jargon in there. Unique features, SARS-CoV-2. I think that's COVID. Wuhan, I think I'm a little bit familiar. Some of our viewers probably know, but just break this down for the average person. They have a little bit of familiarity with COVID, with the lab leak and more. What did you find in this report?
Sure. So it's a little bit of an understated headline, I'll give you that. But takeaway is origins of COVID solved, question mark.
Okay. Yeah.
Basically, what we found is that some of the most unusual features of the SARS-CoV-2 genome, the things that made SARS-CoV-2 the most pathogenic virus of the last 100 years were, they're very rare in nature, but they were central to the esoteric research interests of the top coronavirus virologists in the world, Ralph Baric, and the top coronavirus collectors in the world, Peter Daszak and the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We also found that while these scientists told the U.S. government that they were going to be doing this high-risk virology at UNC under relatively strict biosafety protocol, they were actually going to secretly be outsourcing much of this research to the Wuhan Institute of Virology under an inadequate biosafety level, essentially in order to save on costs and to be able to do the work more quickly. So, obviously that is very concerning.
Yeah, I would say so.
All right, so let's talk about the Alex Washburn et al. Preprint that kind of led to this reporting that you did. And so we can go back to Bob Gary, too, who's a Tulane University virologist who people might recall was involved in that first kind of famous and now infamous conference call with Anthony Fauci, February 2nd or 4th or whatever, between the 1st and the 4th, where the virologists all at the beginning are leaning towards a lab leak, and by the end of it are now pronouncing and organizing public statements and articles saying that there couldn't have been a lab leak, and everybody is crazy who thinks it is. So Bob Gary, at the time, observed the makeup of COVID-19 and identified some unusual features of it, which takes us to the Washburn paper. So what did Bob Gary find, and how important was that to your reporting?
Sure. So I'll start out with what is, I think, indisputable at this point from our reporting, and then I'll get into the more controversial stuff. So the stuff that's indisputable is that the scientists working with the Wuhan Institute of Virology were interested in making engineered viruses in the lab and testing whether they could infect human receptors. And their so-called gold standard would be to identify viruses that could cause disease. They were also knowledgeable about two things that could essentially supercharge a coronavirus into that gold standard of something that could cause disease in humanized mice. And those two features were a furin cleavage site at the S1, S2 junction of the spike protein and a receptor binding domain that was very good at latching on to a receptor called ACE2. And when SARS-CoV-2 first came out, those virologists who initially said privately, oh no, this looks engineered, and then came out with a paper that said, if you think that this is engineered, you're crazy. They were privately very concerned about these two features, the furin cleavage site at the S1, S2, and the fact that it was sort of immediately very good at infecting human cells. And so the documents that we obtained show, they lay out their plan to create a model where they could create engineered viruses with these features that we later see in SARS-CoV-2, but that are exceedingly rare in nature. So that all is indisputable at this point, I think. There have been people, people like Robert Gary who have really nitpicked and said, well, it's not a furin cleavage site at the S1, S2, it's a furin cleavage site at the S1 or S2. But the new documents we obtained make it very explicit that they were interested in precisely viruses like SARS-CoV-2. The Alex Washburn paper that you mentioned around restriction sites, I think that's a little bit more controversial and requires a little bit more scientific inquiry. But what they found in 2022 is that a pattern of restriction sites, and restriction sites are essentially little bits of code that occur in the genome that can be used in the lab to engineer new viruses, but they also can occur naturally. But what they found, they did a statistics around how likely is it that we would see this precise pattern, and they found it to be very unlikely. And so the new documents that we have, confirm their intention to create synthetic viruses with these restriction enzymes in 6 pieces, which is what the Washburn paper found. And they also include a budget line for one of these specific restriction enzymes.
Let's stop there and talk about that. So the paper says, okay, there's these 6 different, whatever they are. And they basically predicted, okay, if you were going to do this, what you would need would be this one particular enzyme of thousands of enzymes commercially that are available to do this research. And what you found is that they, in fact, did purchase that enzyme and did use this, which suggests that they're doing the exact thing that was predicted. So not only do you have a regression analysis that shows the chance of this being formed naturally is infinitesimally small, but then they add a prediction on top of it that you would need this particular enzyme, and the chance that they actually then purchased that, and it all being a coincidence, takes it from infinitesimally small to me to impossible to be anything other than a smoking gun. So why is it still considered somewhat controversial, even among some people who have recently been saying, yeah, I believe I lean toward a lab leak, but I want to see more scientific inquiry on this?
Yeah, it's sort of hard for us lay people to evaluate because it does require knowledge of statistics and of bioengineering. So the number of people who can really evaluate these claims, I think, is pretty small. But some scientists who are a bit more skeptical, like Alina Chan, they basically point to other viruses in nature that are very similar to SARS-CoV-2 having similar restriction sites. Then you get kind of another layer of complexity, which is that there is a debate about how many silent mutations you would see around these sites in nature versus in the lab. And so I think that's something that scientists need to duke out. I think another, just a cautionary word I've heard is that Ralph Baric, this coronavirologist who was working very closely with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, he was known for doing this sort of work without any of these sort of markings, without leaving the restriction sites in. He patented no-seum technology, no-seum being the name of a insect in North Carolina where he's based. So it's almost unusual to find a pattern like this if we expect it to be Barrick's idea that the Wuhan lab was working with.
Yeah, what really concerns me, Emily, is, look, I've never believed, obviously, in natural origin, but let me ask you then, Crystal often does this, how would you steelman, your reporting? What natural origin hypothesis at this point even bears scrutiny for a seasoned healthcare reporter like yourself? What would the critics say in response to this? I know, I feel the same way. That's why I'm asking you. Yeah.
Well, I think the possible coincidence of the pandemic first being detected at the wet market, I think that story still hasn't been told. How is it that that was the first place where we started detecting cases? I think the idea that early cases clustered around the wet market is based on a really bad analysis. I think the idea that spillover occurred at that market is based on an analysis that was recently suffered a major correction.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Right.
So it's hard, but I do, I'll give it to my opponents, I guess, and say that I think it is hard to explain, just given the information that we have, the limited information, why it was the wet market that, where we first.
But can't we just say, well, yeah, that's where the Chinese first reported the cases? They're the ones who are responsible for, we